The funding for this program is provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and the Friends of 4, 10, and 12.
How safe are the children in Idaho daycare centers, and should the centers be licensed by the state? We'll look at that story tonight. Good evening. The last session of the Idaho legislature failed despite several efforts to pass legislation requiring some licensing of daycare centers in Idaho. But for a variety of reasons, it seems that the issue of daycare licensing just won't go away. For one thing, the incidence of child abuse or neglect in daycare centers is constantly in the headlines nationally. Our focus tonight is on whether some licensing is needed in Idaho and also on how safe the daycare centers are here. We start tonight with two reports. The first from Bruce Reichert in Boise.
A man convicted in California of molesting children moves to Idaho and runs a daycare center in Coeur d'Alene called the Busy Bee. The center is shut down only after a dozen Idaho children are abused. In Boise, a mental patient accused of killing her own child has no trouble getting a state daycare license. The woman is later linked to 20 suspicious fires in the area. And another Boise, and this one a convicted burglar, is told by a judge to stop offering daycare, even though he and his common-law wife have been operating a facility for several years. The 1984 legislature has come and gone, and so have any attempts at regulating daycare centers on a statewide basis. Even though the vast majority of Idaho legislators wanted some kind of control over daycare centers, the Senate and the House couldn't agree on who should have that control, whether it should be the counties or the State Department of Health and Welfare. Well, last week, the Boise City Council decided that it wasn't going to wait any longer for the legislature to make up its mind. Last Monday night, they rushed through some amendments which would give city officials some guidelines in determining whether to grant or revoke daycare licenses. Now, the bill isn't perfect, mind you, but according to city officials, it's less vague than the previous ordinance. The Boise law now requires child care operators to be at least 18 years old. Furthermore, they can't have had their licenses revoked in the last 3 years, nor can there have been in the last 3 years a felony, larceny, or sexual misconduct conviction.
After this legislative session, it really brought it home to us that if anything was going to be done on daycare licensing, the cities were going to have to do it themselves.
William Fawcett is the author of Boise's new daycare bill. We asked him why he put a 3-year limit on convictions, even if those convictions are for sex crimes.
From the cases that I've seen in the past, an ordinance which gave that much control, that much discretion to the licensing authority would probably be held to be unconstitutionally vague. And therefore, we would have no licensing ordinance rather than a specific licensing ordinance. At least what we have here now is better than what we have anywhere else in the state.
But if child abuse is a sickness not easily cured, one wonders if a 3-year limit is the answer.
That could very well be so. I'm not familiar with your sources, and I haven't had those readings.
We felt that it really strengthened the ordinance. Now again, you know, we might look at a few years down the line and realize that exactly what you said happened. Hopefully it doesn't.
Boise's city clerk likes the new ordinance. Under the old one, she had the difficult task of judging a daycare operator's character and reputation to see if that person should get a license.
The way it was so vague before, it put a lot of the discretion upon me, that I had to determine whether an applicant met those qualifications. And as anything, you know, you can be arbitrary and one day maybe feel this situation fits here and not here, and then you discriminate.
The new ordinance hasn't changed one thing. Boise's daycare operators must still be licensed, first by the state and then by the city. The city's license ensures a fire inspection, a building inspection, and a police check on everyone at the facility. But city officials say only half of Boise's almost 200 daycare facilities have even bothered to get a license.
They are in violation. What we want to do is work with the operators, that many might have been unaware that they needed the license or didn't realize how important the license. I think it's getting more important all the time just because citizens are contacting the office.
If you're not willing to enforce the daycare ordinance, why even bother with another ordinance?
Okay, we are cracking down. We're starting with the larger facilities and dealing with smaller facilities on a complaint basis.
But while Boise officials say they are serious about licensing child care facilities, they admit they can't do it alone.
We need the interest of individuals. We need parents to become involved in the system and pay more attention to their daycares. We need the manpower to review it and vigilance.
What do you need from the legislature?
It would be nice if if the state arm had enforcement powers. As it is now, it's a toothless lion.
But some daycare operators in Idaho are adamantly opposed to any form of state licensing. So far, they've carried the day with the Idaho legislature. The leading opponent of state licensing for years has been daycare operator Della Jolly of Pocatello. Here's Paula Whistle.
The children begin arriving here around 7 a.m. By 9, most of the 30 youngsters, infants to 6 years of age, who will occupy the basement of this house for the day, will be here.
Is he coming? You've noticed as each child has arrived, their name has been written down and the time. Later on, we check and make sure every child is here. We do this about 11:30. We have all the children line up on the bench, and we call every name to make sure that we haven't lost a child.
There is no sign identifying this as Jolly's Daycare Center and Kindergarten. According to Della Jolly, that's so that this will blend into this residential neighborhood in Pocatello. This is just one of 3 businesses owned by Della Jolly and her husband. They operate a wedding chapel a few blocks away and sell food storage items out of their home.
Spread out right there's a spot. Would you go get your sister's socks, honey? Would you go get her socks? She only has one of them.
Norman and Della Jolly have operated the daycare center for almost 20 years. They pride themselves on the fact that it is a family business. Several of their daughters are actively involved in the business on a daily basis.
In the early morning, like when you first came, when there's just a few children, my husband was on while I was getting my own children going. And then as the number grows, in just a few minutes, my daughter will come on. And this is the time when we separate them. The older children are taught by my husband. They have a very good, progressive kindergarten program, and the little ones do some activity, learning activity.
Salute the flag, the grand old flag, with colors red, white, and blue.
One often hears in this part of Idaho that government has gotten too big, that the state's bureaucracies have become too powerful, and that personal freedoms are being violated. Della Jolly's zealous opposition to the state licensing of daycare centers is based on many of these same issues. In her opinion, the State Department of Health and Welfare should not be in the business of inspecting and licensing daycare facilities.
First of all, the daycare inspectors would be a law unto themselves. I'm for local control where the people are elected. In the daycare bill, in the Idaho Code, it says that the Health and Welfare has the right to write any rules and regulations they deem necessary and the right to enforce their own regulations. It gives them a blank check. The last bill that was up before the legislature was ridiculous. It said that it covered daycare homes, and if you cared for 4 or less children, you would have to be state licensed. This would make it necessary for Health and Welfare to inspect practically every home in the state, and it would make it practically a police state in investigating every home. If you cared for 2 children under the age of 2, you would have to have 2 people on duty at all times. It would make it financially prohibitive I think that state licensing would give a stamp of approval, and that parents would think the state has inspected for me, and it might let down the parents' guard. Parents are the best inspectors. They walk in without knocking at any time throughout the day. They are caring people. If some do not care, there are enough that do care. That yes, I believe that the free enterprise system will keep the quality high. I do believe this, that any daycare or people involved with children would be willing and should be willing to allow themselves to be submitted to a police check to make sure that they have nothing on the record.
I have 3 children, and I brought all 3 of them here.
What, you obviously like it. What do you like about it?
They get a lot of TLC here. They've just really been well taken care of. Anytime I've had a sick child here, I've always been called immediately. I just really feel that the people here are loving and caring.
How do you feel about state licensing of daycare centers?
I don't feel that it's necessary at all. I, for one, can't afford it. I've tried another nursery, and I've paid $10 a day for one child. And compared to what I pay here, I'd rather bring them here where I know the people and the prices are better. They do get good care.
How much do you pay here?
I pay $4 a day.
Most of the places that are state licensed, well, not most of the places, the place that you hear that things are going wrong are state licensed.
I think all that state licensing would cause is an increase in daycare rates, which I personally cannot afford.
I don't like that. It's just another thing the state is trying to dip their little fingers into.
It creates a problems for the daycare owners where they have to maintain a certain ratio for their kids, and the prices that they would have to charge would be more than they'd want to charge and more than probably I would be able to afford.
What would you do if state licensing became mandatory?
I'm afraid that no matter what I did, they would find something that, so rather than be intimidated out of business, I would close voluntarily, because I was told, I said, if these regulations go in, will you close me? Now, this inspector had never been to my place, and he said, as quickly and as quietly as possible.
More on the daycare licensing controversy in Idaho now from 3 people who have followed the issue from 3 different perspectives. Donna Scott is a state representative from Twin Falls. Representative Scott is a member of the House Health and Welfare Committee, a committee which considered daycare licensing legislation during the last legislative session. Sharon Bixby is one of the principal advocates for a state licensing program. She lobbied for that in the legislature. She's from Boise. And Ray Winterrode works for the Idaho Department of Health and Welfare as the Bureau Chief for the Division of Social Services. He oversees what voluntary licensing now takes place. Mr. Winterrode, let me ask you about what Mrs. Jolly just said there in that last comment on the videotape. In essence, that she fears that the Department of Health and Welfare, the state, would be shutting down her daycare center, and presumably others like hers, if there were state licensing.
I've heard that comment in the past, and to the best of my knowledge, there's no foundation for that concern on her part. Basically, the operation and what I've heard about the operation that she runs is a licensable type of operation.
So, bottom line is she doesn't have much to fear from what has been proposed, not enacted in Idaho.
I don't believe so. I really don't. There's a number of those concerns that we hear. For instance, the talk about if we have mandatory licensing that the costs will go out of sight. There have been surveys done in the state of Idaho which just indicate that that just is not true.
I want to come back to that question, but let me first return to the basic question that I put at the beginning of the broadcast, and I want to ask each of you about this. Representative Scott, in your view, how safe are these daycare centers in Idaho? I know that's a tough question, but in general, how safe are they?
Well, one thing that I would like to point out is that you can, at this present time, get a state license for your daycare center. And I believe those individuals who bother to get a state license, do it for advertising purposes. And of course, if they're in the yellow pages and someone comes from out of state and sees that here's a daycare center that's licensed by the state, it should be safe. And they willingly and eagerly take their child there to be cared for just because they advertise as such. But as we found out in Coeur d'Alene, this didn't mean a great deal, because in this daycare center, the individual was licensed by the state, but as Keith Potter mentioned, a 5-minute check of his background would have proven that he was not a safe person to leave your children with. And it was a delightful surrounding, very cute, and people went there in droves and took their children, and many of them were abused.
So is the lesson there that state licensing would not necessarily assure safety?
Not in Idaho at this time. State licensing wouldn't unless it were mandated, but our biggest problem there is that the mandate of the licensing of the facility doesn't preclude that the individual might not abuse the child.
Ms. Bixby?
Well, I think there's more to safety than not having an adult who's going to sexually molest the children. That those cases, of course, are bizarre and shouldn't happen, but probably the biggest safety hazard we have right now is too many children and not enough adults. And that's one thing that state licensing can look at. If we have a uniform set of standards statewide.
You mean a ratio of the number of supervisors, if you will, to the number of children they're taking care of.
Right.
And that's one thing that state licensing could assure.
Mm-hmm.
Representative Scott, true?
Well, I believe that the child's safety is something that the government should be concerned about, and the worst atrocity would be the sexual abuse of the child. But it's up to the parent to decide whether or not the daycare center is clean, or it's going to be large enough, or they're going to be well cared for. And I believe this is brought home. Recently I attended a seminar in Twin Falls that was put together by a child abuse team. And at this time I would certainly like to commend the media for this issue that's been brought forth to the public in regards to child abuse. It's a national issue at this time. And at this seminar, the woman who put it together was an individual from Oregon. And she said the answer lies in parental responsibility, the communication with your child at a very young age to help them know what to look for, how to protect themselves against other people who might be about to harm them. So from that point of view, I see the very importance of parental responsibility, and that's why I would like to see that happen.
Really, the parents are the best inspectors.
I believe they are.
Ms. Bixby?
I think there are certain things that parents can look for, and they can certainly exercise their personal preferences and philosophy. Are the activities that are going on there the kinds of things they want their child involved in? How much television is watched? What kind of television is watched? What kind of discipline is used? But I think there are some safety issues that parents have a difficult time inspecting for. Are the poisons always in a locked cabinet? Are there rough edges in the playground equipment? How much space is really available? Are parents going to measure that? Parents are not going to look into the more physical kinds of things. They're going to look more into, is this place going to be a home away from home for my child?
And these are things, in your view, that a uniform state licensing system could address, right?
I think if the regulations are carefully written and the people who are involved in the implementation of the regulations are knowledgeable about daycare, I think that it can address those kinds of things, yeah.
Mr. Winterode, Representative Scott mentioned the celebrated incident in Coeur d'Alene, and Bruce Reichert earlier mentioned a couple in the local Boise area not long ago. My question is, are those isolated sort of 1 in 1,000 type incidents, or do we even know how frequent those sorts of things take place?
Unfortunately, they aren't isolated kind of experiences. We get complaints weekly, daily in some cases, from all over the state on daycare providers. Some of them are very serious, and some of them are minor kinds of complaints, but it is a fairly frequent kind of thing. I wouldn't want to paint a picture that daycare providers are a bad lot, because they aren't. by and large, they're good caliber people who are providing a necessary service in Idaho. But yeah, it's a frequent, and a lot of the complaints are valid, as the Coeur d'Alene situation
And state
was.
licensing would help you get at some of those problems?
Certainly would. I think the Coeur d'Alene incident is an example, and one of the Boise situations is an example.
Well, Representative Scott said earlier that that fellow in Coeur d'Alene was licensed by the state. He had a state license.
Mm-hmm. We currently do not have a system of mandatory background police record, criminal records checks on daycare providers who are licensed by the state. And
So
that's
if
a
an
weakness under our current.
I see. So if an operator gets one of these voluntary licenses, doesn't really mean very much. Is that what you're saying?
As far as, it varies from place to place in the state. If the operator agrees to a background check, then that is done in some cases.
Is that
we
the
can't
really,
give that guarantee at
right,
this
is that
point.
the really critical thing, the background check?
I believe that is one of the critical things.
Okay.
I think there are other critical issues as well, but that one is certainly important.
Ms. Bixby?
I think one real critical issue worth bringing up is that if an operator or a place is found to be unsafe or there's some molestation going on and a license is revoked, there's nothing to stop the person from continuing to operate. Parents find out about what's going on. They immediately pull their children out of these places. They know better. But unfortunately, unknowing parents fill those slots quickly. And so that those people who are committing the worst crimes are reaching even more children than the good providers who keep their children there for years.
Well, Representative Scott, you're hearing the case for state licensing. You've heard it before, I know.
Right, right.
Counter what they're saying.
Now, as a little history for the people who aren't aware, when the Senate bill came to the House, it was obvious that it wasn't going to fly in its present state, the way it was.
The Senate bill was a state licensing
Yes,
bill.
it was a state licensing bill with the health and welfare in place to do the inspections. And we had a 6-6 vote, and of course it died in committee. And at that time, I was as concerned as anyone about the welfare of children in daycare centers. And when I realized it wasn't going to make it, I offered to work all summer on a new bill. And our chairman felt there wasn't that much time. He said, "You've got till Tuesday." So we put together a bill in about 4 days. And we worked with the Attorney General's office, so the bill we had was constitutional. We worked with some local people that were involved with daycare centers, with Keith Potter from the police department. We worked with...
I don't want to interrupt you, but in essence, it was a county license bill to let county governments do some of this checking that these
It
folks
brought
are
it to a
talking about.
local level, which was not something that the people who objected to the Senate bill would object to. They did not object to having a background check. They said, "Hey, we're clean, fingerprint us if you want." They didn't object to that, and they did not object to have it brought to a local level where the counties were responsible for doing the safety inspections and fire inspections, which would look for some of the things that Sharon is concerned about. From then on, they felt it was the responsibility of the parent to choose a good daycare center.
Ms. Bixby, you didn't think that went far enough.
I think that the counties were not going to be able to do what the bill was mandating that they do, and they even said that to us. And also a city official has told me here in Boise they don't have, we heard it on the tape, we don't have the manpower, we don't have the expertise to carry this out. How are all these little communities, smaller counties, unpopulated counties, going to hire somebody with expertise in daycare to be able to enforce and carry out the bill?
How will they do it, Representative Scott?
Well, first of all, I commend the Boise City for what they've done. Perhaps they need to include the county, because I'm sure a facility could move outside the city limits and practice what they pleased without abiding by the city ordinance.
But I think Ms. Bixby's point was that the city of Boise, you heard the city clerk almost admit that they're cracking down now, but only now after a couple of celebrated cases. There are many centers that are not licensed, despite it being the law. Tough job for local governments.
True, but this is where it should take place. on a local level. This is what people have said. They want local control, and yet when we give them local control, then they go through this difficult period of time of figuring out how to work it out. But as I have mentioned also, we're going through a period of time of national focus on this problem. More people than ever are aware of the horrible things that are happening in regard to child abuse, and I believe parents at this time are opening their eyes and saying, what can we do to avoid it?
Wouldn't some system at a lower level, county government level, work, Mr. Winterode?
I'm not really pro or con for state-ran or county-ran. I can see advantages and disadvantages both ways. And if we had an adequate bill that is designed to ensure that the basic kind of things that need to be done to protect children were done, whether it's at the county level or the state level, it wouldn't matter to me. I obviously see advantages to the state level because you have the state-wideness capability built in for standards for the program.
Right. It seems to me, I'm not going to put words in Representative Scott's mouth, but Mrs. Jolly seemed to be saying on the tape earlier that they're really concerned about this faceless, nameless bureaucracy coming in and inspecting homes and ordering people around and drawing up regulations.
I think that
that's what it really boils down to in a lot of cases.
It's a natural fear when you say an inspection by the Department of Health and Welfare. I think that's not something that people open their arms up and say, welcome. A lot of licensed providers now, we have 640 at any given time, licensed providers, and I would say we have positive working relationships with the majority
That's
of them.
one of the problems, though, is it not, that people are really concerned about the state Department of Health and Welfare coming on their property?
Big Brother.
Yeah.
1984 is here, you know, the government is moving in, and people fear, perhaps down the road, looking at a government-controlled daycare center, and that they would be molding the minds of the children. And they really think about this, and you have to listen to those people because their concerns are vital. But there's another issue that we might be thinking about, and this is the fact that sometimes, and very often, your state-licensed daycare centers are subsidized by the government, not only for the care of ADC children, but also grocery items. They used to provide funds for some appliances in kitchens where daycare centers needed. Now, that is no longer a fact. And it's also true that they are no longer providing the subsidies, and that will become less. And instead, they will provide a tax credit for people who pay for it.
Let me just give Ms. Bixby the last word here. If some of your concerns about the counties being able to do this job could be somehow salved, would that be enough?
I think it's important to think about what the goals of licensing are. One is to protect the children, two is to upgrade the quality of care, and three is to, through an educational process, also to protect the rights of the providers.
Yeah.
And when I hear Boise City say we're going to upgrade our law so that we can close some centers down, that's not the goal of licensing.
I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. Time was too short, but we appreciate you being here, Mr. Winterode, and Ms. Bixby, and Representative Scott. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That's our time for tonight. I'm Mark Johnson. Thank you for joining us. Good night.
The funding for this program is provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and the Friends of 4, 10, and 12.